city, or rather the first city, according to archaeologists in the world, was called Ur, U-R. And it's at the base of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers of the Persian Gulf. It's now in ruins. But the oldest continuously populated city in the world is Damascus, Syria. And according to archaeologists, people have been living in and around Damascus in a form of a city or a community for 11,000 years. The Egyptian civilization, as far as we know, goes back 5,000 years.
Millions of people around the world bring Christmas trees, mistletoe, and holly wreaths into their homes to celebrate Christmas. These familiar Christian symbols had pagan roots, but have now come to symbolize the eternal nature of life beyond this world. Was this a fluke or universal spiritual message of hope from the other side? Tonight, Mark Anthony and I look at that and much more. It's coming right up on My Alien Life. My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff.
For centuries, Christians have believed the Star of Bethlehem to be a huge explosion of bright light in the sky. Tonight, ancient astrology and modern astronomy collide to prove the Star of Bethlehem was real, and we're talking about everything Christmas. Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, is back. Mark, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome.
Thank you. It's nice being back on the show.
Yeah, excellent. Last time you were here, we talked about your two passions and your professions, rather, and how they're exact polar opposites. Can you tell our listeners again, just refresh their memory on what you do and how do those two worlds collide?
Well, the media nicknamed me the psychic lawyer, and I guess it stuck because I'm a psychic medium, and I'm descended from generations of people who had the ability to communicate with spirits. But I'm also an attorney, and I'm licensed to practice in Florida, Washington, D.C., and before the U.S. Supreme Court. I've tried over 300 jury trials, so I've been in the trenches. I've done everything from misdemeanors to first-degree murder trials, complex civil litigation. And the thing is, Cameron, that my interests are not just in law and metaphysics, but also in archaeology, history, quantum physics, philosophy, and theology. And I'm known as the psychic lawyer. I'm also known as the psychic explorer because I travel around the world to mystic and spiritual sites to discover and examine supernatural phenomenon and ancient mysteries. So I'm a pretty busy guy, and all I can say is I love what I do. I love being able to study all these unusual facts and phenomenon around the world, and then be able to come on a show like this one and discuss it.
You comment on spiritual topics and how they overlap with history and science. Let's go back about 2,000 years, talk about astronomy, and specifically astronomers who believe there's proof of the existence of the Star of Bethlehem.
There absolutely is. For centuries, people have always heard the biblical story of how the wise men followed a star and that it led to the birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem. And so our common conception is that it's sort of the Christmas card, where the Steven Spielberg-esque light in the sky has a spotlight beaming on a manger. Well, we know that that's not the case, and here's why. The Magi were actually from what is now Iran, and back then it was, they called it Persia, and the Persians were being ruled by the Parthians. I don't want to get too heavy into ancient Iranian history, but long story short, the Parthians were from what is now a part of northern Iran, and it was an empire, very powerful empire, which sat on the eastern border of the Roman Empire. So Parthia and the Roman Empire were always at war on and off, and Judea, which at the time of the birth of Christ was being ruled by King Herod the Great. He was essentially, I don't want to call him a Roman puppet, but he was what was known as a client king of the Roman Empire. In other words, Judea was nominally independent. Herod was allowed to be king. He had his own army, but basically he was under the thumb of the Roman Empire. And Herod was a pretty nasty guy. He married into his wife Mariamne's family, and they were the aristocrats. They were of the Hasmonean dynasty, and before he was installed on the throne by the Romans, they were the rulers of Judea. And so when he married into her family, they became royals. Herod was a really paranoid person and basically had most of her family, including her, eventually executed. But that's okay. He had 8 other wives and 14 more children to accuse of sedition, bribery, and treachery. So Herod was not the nicest guy in the world. Now, why am I bringing that up? Well, Herod, as the king of Judea, his court was Jewish. And in the book of Deuteronomy and in the book of Leviticus, of the Old Testament, which the Jews refer to as the Torah, divination, seeking signs and omens, was forbidden. Well, let's go to Iran now. So that's where the Magi are. And the Magi were the custodians of 23 centuries of astrology and astronomy that started in the city of Babylon. And Babylon is in what is now Iraq, and that was part of the Persian Parthian Empire. So the Magi were from a religious mystical order that have been studying the heavens for centuries, tracking the movements of the stars. And they noticed a convergence, an unusual astrological alignment that was forming within the constellation of Aries. And in the ancient world, each country had an astrological symbol. And the symbol for Judea was the constellation Aries. And so they saw this astrological alignment of the sun, the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn with a lunar eclipse. In other words, the moon blocking out Jupiter, all forming within Aries. And so they knew that meant the birth of a king of divine origin would be born in Judea. And that's what set them off to go see this. Because if the Star of Bethlehem had been a spotlight on a manger, Herod would have noticed that right away. Okay? And the reason that Herod was so threatened by Jesus is because Jesus, according to the book of Matthew, was the descendant of King David of Israel through his mother Mary. So Jesus certainly had the regal bloodline and was considered by many to be a legitimate contender for the throne of Judea and the kingdom of Israel. So there's the groundwork. Now, in about 20 years ago, a Rutgers professor, an astronomer, Michael Molnar, found this ancient Roman coin, and it depicts a ram looking backwards looking back at a star, and it also had the pattern of a crescent moon running along the side of it. And Professor Molnar realized that this coin commemorated an astrological event. and that's what got him studying what was going on in roughly 2,000 years ago that could possibly be this highly unusual event. And he developed a computer program that found this unusual alignment within Aries, and it occurred on April 17th of 6 BC. And the thing about this alignment, it was recently examined in 2016 by Notre Dame University's astrophysics department, and Professor Grant Matthews, who's the head of astrophysics and astronomy. They concluded that this unusual alignment only ever happened once and will only ever happen and will never happen again.
So is that widely accepted in the astronomy community then that's true?
Yes. In the astrophysics and astronomy community, this is accepted based on the computer programs both from Rutgers and Notre Dame, that this astrological phenomenon only ever happened once and will never happen again. And also when Professor Molnar, now Professor Matthews, have presented their positions, this is being widely accepted by a number of theologians. And even though the Bible theoretically bans divination, meaning foretelling the future and looking for omens, the Bible is loaded with stories about this being one of them. And so the Magi were members of the Zoroastrian religion of Persia, and that in astrology and astronomy were one and the same back then. They weren't bound by the Torah and all these, you can't do this and you can't do that. Also, they looked at this not only as a sign from heaven, but this was a very exact science. When we examine archaeological records of the Babylonians and their star charts, Cameron, their calculations as to the movement of constellations and stars are so precise that even by today's standards, they're acceptable and only a couple days off. That's how good the Babylonians were. And the Magi, because Babylon was part of the Parthian Empire, and the Magi had been studying this for well over 1,000 years by the time of Jesus. So that's why when the Magi came, because of this astrological phenomenon, and Herod met with them, because when you have a caravan coming from the Persian Empire and it's loaded with Magi and dignitaries, because the Magi, as an order, they were the bureaucrats of the Persian Empire. I mean, they made it run. They were the diplomats, they were the mystics, the healers, and they were also extensions of the king's authority, which is why they were known as the Three Kings. They weren't kings, but they were extensions of the emperor of the Persian Empire, the Parthian Empire. So, anyway, I hope I'm not going.
No, that's great. I also, when we think about them, the three wise men, and they followed the star to the birthplace of Jesus, there must have been other accounts of these three wise men. Do we only hear about them during the birth of Christ, or do they occur in other parts of biblical history?
Well, the Magi, as an order, were stationed, if you will, from Western China, from India, all through what is now Pakistan, Iran, Iraq. There were even Magi in Egypt, Greece, and Rome because they were diplomats. They were the diplomatic corps, if you will, of the Parthian Empire. So the Magi were everywhere, and the Bible mentions Balthazar, Melchior, and Caspar by name as the three Magi who were the ones that came to pay homage or to certainly see the birth of this divine king, or this king with a divine purpose in life. So while Magi may not be mentioned in other parts of the New Testament, my research indicated, we've all heard the story of Daniel and the lion's den. Remember Daniel and the lion's den? Yeah, okay. Well, guess what? It is believed Daniel may have been a Magi. So anyone from any background, if they had the aptitude, the knowledge, and the skill, could become part of the Magi order. And Daniel was an advisor to, I believe it was King Nebuchadnezzar, who was a Babylonian king. So the Babylonian Empire preceded the Persian Empire, which shows you how long the Magi have been around. So there are references throughout history to other Magi. In fact, Magi, the Greeks refer to magia, is the root word of magic because of the rituals conducted by the Magi to divine the future based on astrology was where we get the word magic, and plural of magi is either magi or magian, well, magian, magician. So the word magic all stems from this because of their ability to interpret dreams, to engage in divining the future through astrology, and for also foretelling the future based on omens and signs. So it's really quite interesting when you look at how mystical the story of the birth of Jesus and the wise men actually is.
I think that we, when some people get afraid or have a fear of the real story of Christmas, but I mean, there's more to it. There's a lot going on back then, and when we think about it, we think of the Christ child being born and Mary and Joseph and everything being so simple, but it was actually a little bit more complicated than we quite know, I believe.
Well, it was quite a bit more complicated. See, when you look at the Bible, all right, there's a prohibition on divination, on foretelling the future, interpreting dreams. But then again, we all know the story in Genesis of Joseph, who was brought before Pharaoh, who was having these disturbing dreams of 7 fat cows emerging from the Nile River only to be devoured by 7 skinny cows, and 7 fat ears of corn to be devoured by 7 skinny ears of corn. And Joseph was the Hebrew sold into slavery by his brothers, and he was thrown into prison in Egypt for various reasons. I'm giving you the abbreviated version. And Pharaoh was so disturbed by these dreams, and his viziers and high priests, they couldn't interpret it. But Joseph had a reputation in the prison for being able to foretell the future. So, and through dream interpretation. So they brought Joseph before Pharaoh, and basically what he says is there'll be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And then you have Saul and the Witch of Endor centuries later, where King Saul is things are going badly. David is on the rise. The Philistines are on the march. Saul's popularity is waning, and his favorite advisor, the prophet Samuel, has died. So Saul goes to the Witch of Endor, whom I believe should be called the medium of Endor. So she facilitates communication between Saul and the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who conveys to him the message that your time is at an end. And of course it was, because he's defeated, his sons are killed in battle, and then he ends up taking his own life. And so this is where psychics and mediums really get a bad rap in the Old Testament and in the ancient world, in the Judeo and later Christian culture, because the rabbis of ancient Judea and Israel said, see what happens when you talk to those people? Okay? But what we look at, and when I say we, I mean mediums, we look at it like this. It was the will of God for David to become the king of the Jews. And then Jesus is descended from David through his mother, Mary. So let's go 10 centuries later, and now this is the time of Herod. Herod and his father basically bribed, cajoled, and worked the Romans to put them on the throne of Israel. And Herod would do anything to stay in power. He was a serial murderer. He had over 300 of his own officers executed in his army. He had his wife, her 2 sons, her grandfather, her uncle, and her mother executed for treason. I mean, this was a very, very paranoid and devious person. He outmaneuvered Pompey the Great, the Roman general, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra and Octavian Caesar in order to keep his throne. So now when you start hearing that there is a descendant from the house of David being born in Judea, and now these mystical magi from the kingdom of Parthia are coming because the stars have told them this. You get someone as unstable and obsessively paranoid as Herod, he's going to go off as rocker that, oh my God, this prophecy is actually coming true. Anyway, so it certainly makes for fascinating research. In fact, on my 2019 tour that I just wrapped up, I give a lecture. I do a lecture series on ancient mysteries, and the lecture for this time of year is the mystical magi, the mystery of the Star of Bethlehem. And these are some of the things that I talk about.
So when you say you go on a tour like this, you're touring America. How does that work, and where can people see you?
If people go to my website, evidenceofeternity.com, you can check my calendar of events. I also would like to invite people to sign up for for my newsletter, which, once you scroll down the page on the website, you'll see a part that says sign up for the newsletter, and you'll be updated on where I'm going to be. We're working now on. I've been booked in several locations throughout the U.S. For the 2020, the Mark Anthony 2020 Visionary Tour. And I'll be, what I do is I do evenings of spirit communication where I use my abilities as a medium to connect random audience members with loved ones in spirit. But I also appear at expos and conventions and afterlife conferences around the country, and I discuss various topics of like the science of the afterlife, how quantum physics proves spirit communication. Then, of course, there's the Ancient Mystery series and then inspirational topics. So I have several different topics that I discuss. And the Star of Bethlehem research has been just absolutely fascinating. It's been a lot of fun, too.
So you're talking about some of the oldest civilization that had documented civilization on the planet. Is there any archaeological evidence to support the Star of Bethlehem?
Yes, the coin that Professor Molnar found with the ram. Okay, when I say a ram looking at a star with the crescent moon, the ram is the symbol for the constellation Aries, because Aries is a ram. The star was the Star of Kings, which was Jupiter, and then there was the lunar eclipse of Jupiter. So when you know what to look for, you start seeing the archaeological evidence there. Plus, we know throughout the ancient world in Egypt, Greece, Rome, certainly in Parthia, India, China, there are observatories. Now, we think of an observatory as having a giant telescope. In those days, an observatory was a place usually in a mountainous region which was drier, because when you get a lot of humidity, it kind of makes the stars more fuzzy. So if you're on a mountain or in a mountainous region with low humidity, the stars are very clear and bright. Also, in a pre-electric society, it's not like there was ambient light, which was drowning out the stars. I mean, if you're ever like in New York City at night, do you really think you can see the stars? Because everything's so well lit up, just like, Las Vegas or LA. But if you get out like in the desert or on the ocean somewhere, and you see in total darkness how big the stars appear. Well, the ancient world, they did this. They would go and they would observe the stars, and they noticed something very interesting, Cameron. They noticed that the constellations would move through the sky, and the Babylonians appear to be the first to note that Polaris, the North Star, didn't move. Okay, it's due north, and the constellations rotated around Polaris. But then there were 5 stars that defied the movements of all the others. They were called the wandering stars. And for some reason, they would go forward, then they'd stop and go backwards. Those 5 wandering stars, they didn't know there was a difference between a planet and a star. Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn are the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. Well, they go into retrograde. And we always hear all the New Age types, oh, Mercury's in retrograde. Well, it's not that Mercury is going forward and then backward in the sky. It's that all the planets move around the sun in a counterclockwise manner, but all the planets are different distances from the sun and go around the sun at different speeds. For example, Mercury orbits the sun every 88 days. We orbit the sun every 365 days. Mars, like 680 something days. Jupiter, 12 years. Pluto, 250 years. Okay? And so when we're going around the sun and you see another planet, as our orbit and our perception and viewpoint changes because our orbit is faster or slower depending on the planet, it appears that we're moving ahead and then the planet's moving backwards. So it's not that Mars or Jupiter or Saturn or Mercury is moving backwards and forwards. It's simply the perspective, the angle, and the position that we're seeing it. So in the ancient world, they did not know why these stars did that, these planets did that, but they knew that they did it, and they studied it long enough to start determining predictability and patterns. So that's why when they started seeing the movement of the constellations along with these planets based on their centuries of experience and data, they knew that this alignment was going to be coming, and it was so incredibly unique that is what gave rise to the Star of Bethlehem. Plus, the New Testament was written in Greek. Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic. The Gospels weren't written until 50 to 60 years after the death or resurrection of Jesus. So it was told from Aramaic, eventually to Greek, because Greek was the language of the Eastern Mediterranean, and then translated and reinscribed for centuries from Greek to Greek to Greek, then to Latin. And it became we saw his star in the east. Well, in this astrological alignment, it's not that the star was in the east, it's that Jupiter was the morning star, which meant that right after sunrise, Jupiter was visible, ergo in the east. Also, the ancient Greek word for star is asteri, and the plural of stars is asteros, and the word for constellation is asteramos. So, and they're spelled almost identically. So in the translations, it could have been originally written as stars or constellation, but it was eventually translated, or rather mistranslated, as the singular of star as opposed to the plural. And so that's why there's this Christmas card conception of we followed a star, which is a spotlight on a manger. Because let me tell you something. If Herod the Great knew that it saw a spotlight on a manger, and that was the descendant of David, he would send his soldiers in and killed him right then and there, which is what he did later on. But Jesus, Mary, and Joseph had slipped away, guided by an angel to go to the land of Egypt.
Right. Let me ask you this really quick while I'm thinking about it, because what came first? These three men are out in the desert wandering around, and they see the star. But how did they put two and two together? Were they out searching for somebody or something, or was there a rumor of the Savior, or did it come together afterward?
Well, they were in the very sophisticated Parthian Empire. You get, once again, there's over by the time of Herod, the Magi were a very ancient order. They had 2,000 years of knowledge, and the Persian Empire certainly had roads and buildings and was highly organized. They could field an army of 150, 200,000 men. The Roman Empire, extremely sophisticated technologically for the time. But they also looked at mystical significance. So you had the Star of Kings, which is Jupiter, in this unusual alignment, which gave mystical significance. And then you had the constellation of Aries, which meant a great king of Judea of divine origin. So they wanted to see, who is he? Where is he?
Right.
So it's not like they were wandering around in the desert. They knew exactly where they were going. And that's why when they entered the kingdom of Judea, Herod wanted to know, well, why are you here and what are you doing? It's like if all of a sudden a whole group of Russian diplomats just landed at JFK Airport unannounced. Don't you think somebody from the White House would want to talk to them?
I'd heard that happen quite a bit in the past, so maybe that's but
well, maybe that wasn't the best thing. A bunch of French diplomats, but
yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And everyone knew that the Magi, everyone meaning in politics back then, knew that the Magi carried a tremendous amount of weight and influence, and they had very high political status. I mean, they were known for their wisdom, which is why they called them wise men.
And even though this was a long, long time ago, I mean, they pretty much had that area wired. I mean, they knew what was going on. There weren't a lot of surprises. They kept apprised of everything, and Herod did as well. He knew everybody who paid taxes and how much, and so there was a verbal network of communication there, right?
Oh, absolutely there were. I mean, there's these people saying, oh, well, they couldn't have done this. We tend to have a 21st century arrogance towards our ancestors. The Romans conquered every country that bordered the Mediterranean Sea. Nobody's ever seen anything like it since. And, for all of Rome's shortcomings, because it was an incredibly oppressive slave state, it also had a tremendous amount of technical and political and engineering sophistication. The Persians did too. And then to the east of Persia, you had the kingdoms in India, which were thousands of years old by the time of Jesus. And then to the east of that, you had the kingdoms in China. So basically from China all the way to Spain, there was this belt of civilization. And in between, you had some, wild and crazy countries into the north. And you had the Vikings in northern Europe, and you had, the Russians and the Magyars and the Cossacks in Central Asia and all that. But civilization certainly was firmly rooted throughout the time. And we know that, the Romans could construct aqueducts, and their precision in engineering was fantastic. Babylonians were calculating star charts 23 centuries before the birth of Christ. The Egyptians, erecting pyramids and all these other fantastic architectural wonders. So there were, human beings were no less clever back then. It's just they had a different level of technology. And, it's like when I was in Central America and I was studying the Mayan ruins, and, everyone's like, nobody, they built these without metal tools. And of course, everyone's like, oh, well, UFOs came. Well, maybe UFOs did. But on the other hand, the Mayans said, well, we're going to do this. And they didn't say, well, gee, we don't have metal tools. First off, they didn't know what metal tools were. And they, because they don't have metal tools, that doesn't mean they couldn't figure out how to do it in some other way. It's like when the United States made the decision to go to the moon. Well, because we'd never done it before doesn't mean we couldn't do it, and that you can't figure out how to do it. And it was the same thing back then. So you had a very high level of sophistication, and certainly they had that with astronomy, with observing the stars. And the thing about astronomy and astrology is while the court of Judea may not have practiced it, the Egyptians did, the Greeks did, the Romans did, the Indians did, and the Chinese did. And through the Magi, because the Persian Empire is in the middle of all those cultures, there was a free flow of information back and forth. And it was the Greeks who taught the Romans astronomy and astrology, and they traded information with the Egyptians and so on and so forth. So smart people like to talk to other smart people. Scientists like to talk to other scientists. It's politicians who screw everything up.
I would agree with you there. The Romans in Judea were extremely successful, and Herod was a very, very powerful leader. So what do you account for, there was this continental effort to build and they built everywhere. How did that happen? How did they communicate these projects and gather these people together in such a monumental effort to create these huge ruins that we see now, when, basically they were working with stone tools and early metal tools, and how did that even happen? What kind of leadership did that take, and how did they communicate that?
Well, quite a bit of leadership. When you look at the Middle East, the oldest city, or rather the first city, according to archaeologists in the world, was called Ur, and it's at the base of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers on the Persian Gulf. It's now in ruins, but the oldest continuously populated city in the world is Damascus, Syria. And according to archaeologists, people have been living in and around Damascus in a form of a city or a community for 11,000 years. I mean, that's a very long time.
That's huge, yeah.
That's huge. The Egyptian civilization, as far as we know, goes back 5,000 years, although when I was at the Edgar Cayce Ancient Mysteries Conference, there was some scientists, Robert Scotch, and he was explaining how it appears that the Great Sphinx predates the pyramids by thousands of years. And he's a geologist, and he was showing erosion patterns and things, really fascinating stuff. But what happens in a society is, once you solve the mystery of the seed, in other words, you can plant the seed, start to plant and cultivate crops, and then you no longer have to be hunter-gatherers. You become an agricultural society, and then you begin to create a system of abundance, and so that there's plenty of food. And the definition of politics is the allocation of resources. So once you eliminate the threat of people starving to death, it starts creating more surplus time, and you begin to organize labor to build and construct, usually defenses first. Let's protect ourselves, build walls, and then as the society becomes more powerful, that's when these huge building projects begin to be constructed. When you look at ancient Rome, okay, in the time of, let's say by 100 AD, 100 years after Christ, more water flowed into ancient Rome through Roman aqueducts and irrigation systems than flows into Manhattan today.
Wow.
That's pretty intense.
Very intense.
And these were people that didn't have electricity or pumps. And I love when everyone's like, well, the aliens did it. It's like, well, maybe the aliens did, but from all accounts, the Romans figured out how to do it. Okay? Now, there's some things in archaeology that defy explanation, like the Urfa Man and sites on the Turkish-Syrian border that appear to be like 10,000 years old, and the sculpting techniques and the refinement and the engineering skills surpass anything that we knew was in existence. And that certainly, opens up maybe aliens did it. But when you look at the accomplishments of the Persians and the Indians and the Romans and the Greeks, to me, it was the brilliance of human beings that decided to do this. And then that brings us to the time of Herod. During the time of Herod, food, for the most part, was in supply. His kingdom was doing trade with Egypt and the rest of the Roman Empire. So there's food and wine and manufactured goods, glass, oil, like olive oil going around. And so Herod is known as the Great because he built a port, the port of Caesarea, rebuilt the Temple of Solomon, and rebuilt Jerusalem, and he built these fortresses. I mean, he brought Judea to a level of prosperity and power that it hadn't known since the time of King David, and the whole while, keeping the Romans happy. Then after he died, of course, the Romans started gobbling up the empire. I mean, what was left of his kingdom. But at any rate, that's how it's. Once you solve the issue of food, and then you start creating a military that can protect the people, then that's when the building projects and the engineering feats and the science begin to rise. Because people who are worrying about where their next meal is going to come from aren't going to be sitting there doing engineering problems. That's something that you do when there's a surplus.
One of the things I find fascinating about the Bible and the Middle East is symbolism, specifically triads. Are they just a coincidence? I mean, when we talk about the Magi, we're talking gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Is there symbolism in that, and what does it mean?
There's huge symbolism in that. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh have a mystical significance to the mission of Jesus in this world. Gold was given to him as a symbol of his regal bloodline for the king. And in the ancient world, the Egyptians believed that gold retained the power of the sun. It retained light. And the reason for that is because gold never tarnishes and never needs to be polished. So gold symbolized the wealth, the power, and the light. Frankincense, countries went to war over frankincense. It comes from the sap of the boswellia tree, and it burns and it smells sweet. And having a sweet-smelling incense in a time when sewage was all over the place. I mean, the Romans had running water and all that, but most of the cities in the Middle East at that time didn't. So frankincense was highly valued, but also there was a mystical significance to frankincense. It represented Jesus' nature as a prophet and a spiritual teacher, because when you burn frankincense, the smoke is white. And so when people pray in Greek Orthodox and Catholic and in more esoteric Christian mystical sects, when you pray while burning frankincense, the smoke is white, and the white symbolizes your intentions going to heaven, to the white light of God. Then the gift of myrrh symbolized the sacrifice that Jesus made by sacrificing his life and being put to death for essentially not doing anything wrong. And myrrh is associated with the burial of kings, because myrrh repels insects. So a body anointed with myrrh would not be decomposed and would not be fed upon by vermin. Also, myrrh, like frankincense, it has a more pungent odor, but it too burns white, so that when you pray and burn myrrh, the smoke is white and your intentions also go to God. So gold for Jesus as the king, frankincense as his mission as the prophet and the spiritual teacher, and myrrh for his spirituality of transcending this world into the next.
Let's jump ahead 2,000 years. Globally, millions of people around the world celebrate Christmas, and we know that these Christian symbols had pagan roots. Is this a fluke or a universal message from the other side?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. As we jump ahead 2,000 years, globally, millions of people around the world celebrate Christmas, and we have a lot of Christian symbols associated with Christmas, and they've come to symbolize the eternal nature of life beyond the world. Is that a fluke, or is it a universal message of hope from another side?
Oh, absolutely a universal message of hope. I mean, look at the Christmas tree. Now, you ever been driving, Cameron? You ever been driving or just walking by a construction site and you see a branch, like an evergreen branch at the top of the building when
Right.
there's just beams? That is an ancient Viking ceremony known as the topping out ceremony, and construction workers will put a branch at the top of a building to appease the tree spirits who had to sacrifice their lives to create this building. and it's also a symbol of hope that the building will last forever. So throughout the cultures of Northern Europe, Germany, and Scandinavia, I'm just going to call them the Nordic cultures, evergreens symbolized eternal life because in the winter, when food supplies ran scarce and people could die, evergreens didn't. That's why they're called evergreen, because they didn't die even the darkest, coldest time of the year. So the Romans also used to celebrate Saturnalia and winter solstice. Saturnalia is on December 25th, and winter solstice is coming up in, a couple days, Saturday actually, the darkest day of the year. And the Romans used to have a big party, orgy basically, and they would exchange gifts of evergreens as a symbol of eternal life and surviving the winter. And as time went on, people began to bring these evergreens into their house on the celebration of the solstice. And it really caught on in Germany. And then when Prince Albert married Queen Victoria, he brought Christmas trees into Buckingham Palace. And it became all the rage in London. And then it was the rage in London. It caught on in the U.S. And so that's where the Christmas tree started as a symbol of eternal life. And these are reoccurring themes because people looked at the winter as the end of life. You always hear about, when you're born, that's spring, and then, when your life is in summer, you're in full swing, and then autumn, you start getting older, then winter symbolizes death. And evergreens transcend all of those and never die. And so that's why evergreens are associated with everlasting life, which is associated with Jesus' teachings of being about everlasting life.
Interesting. What about mistletoe? Where did that come from, kissing under the mistletoe?
Mistletoe's a trip. Mistletoe's a trip. Talking about Vikings again. The Viking god Balder, he was sort of the rock star surfer dude, had the long flowing hair, and he'd show up at Valhalla, the heaven of the Viking gods, and all muscly, and there was a thing among the gods to shoot him with arrows and spears and throw knives at him because he was invulnerable to everything except mistletoe. And the evil, mischievous god Loki persuaded Balder's twin brother Hoder, who is blind, to shoot an arrow at Balder during one of these, Valhalla parties. But Loki tricked him into using a mistletoe tip, so it kills Balder. And the gods are devastated because Balder was everybody's, favorite rock star, groovy guy god. And so the queen of the gods, Balder's mother Freya, appealed to Hel, the goddess of the underworld, to restore Balder's life. And on the third day, ironically, Balder rose from the dead. And so Freya was so happy that she vowed anyone who walked under mistletoe hanging from a tree, she would plant a kiss upon them. And so mistletoe became a Viking symbol of defeating death. And that's why we kiss under the mistletoe.
Excellent. Lights on Christmas trees, is that an old 1925 Montgomery Ward invention?
I think that's when it went electric. What's really fascinating about that, Martin Luther, who formed Protestantism, okay, not Martin Luther King Jr., the
Sure.
great American civil rights leader, but where he got his name was from a priest who turned against the Catholic Church because of its corruption and selling indulgences and things. And Martin Luther was a very pious man, and he was working on a sermon, and he was walking home one night, and he stopped in the woods, and he saw a fir tree, and the stars in the sky shone through the fir tree. And when he ran home, it was in Germany, and they'd had a tree inside. He insisted his family put candles in the tree to recreate the stars, the light. And that's where that tradition comes from. which I always thought was really cool. It's also extremely dangerous. Hey, let's cut a tree down, stick it in our house, and then put candles in it. And to this, yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy. But see, back in the olden times, people just did that on Christmas Eve. Nowadays, Christmas trees in stores go up, it's Halloween, and they're through New Year's. But traditionally, trimming the tree was a family activity people did on Christmas Eve. They do the tree and they stick the candles in it, and so they sit there around and then they blow out all the candles and make sure that didn't burn the house down. But that's where the lights in the Christmas tree comes from, is starlight through the branches of a fir tree.
And thank goodness over the years that lights on the tree became so much safer than it was before. Then we had to start deep frying the turkey in the garage, and we're still out in the self-destruction mode somehow. But so the patron.
So
go ahead, Marcus.
Go ahead.
I was thinking the patron saint of Russia became very popular in the U.S. How did the patron saint of Russia gain popularity, and why?
Saint Nicholas.
Saint Nicholas.
The stockings were hung by the chimney with care in the hopes that Saint Nicholas soon would be there.
That sounds
We've
right.
all heard that. Well, what happened is Saint Nicholas lived around the year 350, 360 AD, and he lived in what is now Turkey. So the question is, how did an olive-complected Greek-speaking 4th century bishop turn into a portly Norwegian guy that flies around the world in a sleigh driven by reindeer distributing gifts made by slave labor in China? Sorry, that last part was politically incorrect, although true.
You're a sentimental guy.
Well, it always gets me, you see all these Christian symbols you're looking at made in China by, atheist, communist labor. Bishop Nicholas of Myra, he was one of the first great Christian saints, and he was known for his acts of piety and charity. He was an aristocrat, and he turned down the titles and the money and became a very pious Christian. He was oppressed by the Romans, but then when Constantine, the first Christian emperor, ascended the throne and legalized Christianity, Nicholas heard about this family. And this husband and wife, they had 3 little girls, and they were so poor they couldn't afford to keep their daughters anymore. They were going to sell them into slavery, and it was devastating for them. And Nicholas heard about this. And so he crept up to their house the night before they were going to be sold into slavery. And he took a bag of gold and he threw it through the window. And it hit the mantle of the fireplace. And it must have been a cold night because they had their stockings and their shoes around the fireplace to dry. And the gold coins fell on the shoes and the stockings. And the parents went out and they saw that there was gold all over the shoes and the stockings and realized they had enough money so they could keep their children. They didn't have to sell their daughters into slavery.
Wow.
And that's where the tradition of Santa coming down the chimney and hanging stockings. And on the feast of St. Nicholas, because Nicholas, we don't know when he was born, but we know that he died on December 6th. And in Europe, particularly in Holland, Germany, and Austria, kids put their shoes out on the night of December 6th so they get little chocolates and coins in them. And so that's where that tradition comes from. And from there, Nicholas became the patron saint of children, became the patron saint of Greece, of Russia, and his following grew into the Nordic countries, because as the Norse and Viking religion and Balder and all that began to fade and Christianity came, he was extremely popular there. And then when Dutch colonists from Holland came over to the Americas in the early 1600s, they brought with them their traditions about Sinternicolausen, because that's how you say Saint Nicholas in Dutch. and Sinter Nikolausen got converted through mistranslations into English to Santa Claus. So it's kind of quite a wild ride. I'm still trying to figure out how the reindeer fly him across the sky, and then I heard some comedian joke that, well, we all know that Santa's from China in Chinese. Someone said, why? Well, that's why all the toys say made in China on the bottom. But but anyway.
So they every country, has a different name. In England, it's called Father Christmas. What are some of the other names worldwide?
Well, there's many. They're all variations on Saint Nicholas. You ever see that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Yeah. Yes, I did.
Remember when he goes, and here's my son Nick, and Nick,
Right.
Nick.
Right.
And, Nicholas. And there's many stories of Saint Nicholas. He's the patron saint of sailors. There's the story of him raising 3 little boys from the dead. I mean, he's like one of the X-Men of the Christian world, and just a really positive saint. I love the story about him rescuing the little girls from slavery. Now that one, I believe, is most likely rooted in fact, because the idea of coming down the chimney and all that's where we're seeing that.
So where did that come from? So that came from there, and then
that came from there. Well, then there's the naughty and nice list.
Right.
Okay. So if you're nice, you get the gold coins and presents. And see, also when the Magi gave the gifts to Jesus at his birth, that was the beginning of the tradition of giving gifts. And then, of course, with Nicholas throwing the gold through the window. And the reason that Christmas is on December 25th is that in the early Christian world, nobody knew when Jesus was born. It doesn't say anywhere. It's not like CNN was filming it, and the reason December 25th was chosen is once the Roman Empire went from pagan to Christian, the Pope Julius I declared December 25th, which was the Roman festival of Saturnalia, to be the birth of Jesus, and to make it more palatable to the citizens of the empire. Plus, Jesus symbolized the light coming into the world at the darkest time. And so it made for a very logical transition. But as the Viking and the Norse religion was the last of the European religions, pre-Christian religions, to fade away, there's a remnant called Krampus. And Krampus is a half goat, half demon, and he is the son of the goddess of the underworld whose name was Hel. And if you've been bad during the year and made the naughty list, you better expect a visit from Krampus. He's the anti-Santa. I mean, this guy's got horns, long dark hair, fangs, and a snake-like tongue, and he rings bells and chains when he comes to punish bad children during Christmas.
I mean,
so
that's not even the antithesis of Santa Claus. I mean, that is so much worse. I mean, I can't even imagine. Why is that so much worse?
It's really scary.
It's bad.
What's funny is when you see depictions of Krampus and then look at the Grinch,
right.
It's like now you're starting to see where Dr. Seuss got the idea.
I mean, it's close. But...
And, in Krampus, he corners his victims, children. He beats them with birch sticks, and he stuffs them in a sack and then carries them to the underworld. I mean, this is like, I think it's a leftover from Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, there's all sorts of demons and monsters and things. I mean, Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor of Norse mythology. I mean, obviously the elves are earthbound angels. The orcs clearly are like, Krampus's relatives, and so you can see the parallel there. And Krampus is well known in Germany and Austria, but there's other evil Christmas season demons like Bel, Snickle, and Necht Ruprecht. They're bearded men who beat children with switches for being bad at Christmas. And then France has Hans Trop and Pierre Foutard. Okay, and I guess they go around beating children with baguettes or something. But none of the Christmas demons is as dreaded as Krampus. And so he's a leftover from this Norse Viking mythology and a counterbalance to Nicholas because he was used to scare children into behaving. And so Cameron, to this day, in Austria, Germany, Hungary, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic, drunken men, there will be a festival around Christmas, will dress up as devils and run through the streets for a Krempelslauf, which is a Krampus run.
Right.
Okay, so basically it's like having like a Halloween party during Christmas, and these people, I think it's just an excuse to get drunk in public and act like a jerk and scare people. But it really frightens the bejesus out of little kids in Germany, Austria, and Slovenia, and the Czech Republic. Is you better be good, or Krampus is going to take you away. Personally, I think it's like child abuse to tell your children stories like that.
So, is this supposed to be a parallel of Satan, or in some way related, or is it completely different? Or, I mean, it's just.
I think this isn't a demon, not necessarily
right.
Satan, him, or itself, but definitely a demon. And I think if we look at it from a strictly archaeological and sociological standpoint, I think that this was the Nordic religions, like they were trying to counter the incursions of Christianity. And Krampus was the anti-Saint Nicholas. So he was the exact opposite of Nicholas. What is really fascinating is how Balder and Jesus both rose on the third day, and both were associated with light and were like the hero of the gods. And the thing about the Viking Nordic religion is it predated Christianity by millennia. So these religions were all influencing each other. And you get this jumble of things. I mean, Babylonian astrology, you get Nordic mythology, you get Greek and Roman orgiastic festivals as the dates, you get Jewish prophecies about the Messiah, you get Dutch traditions, and then you jumble them all together, and voila, we have Christmas, at least as we know it.
I'm looking online, and there's a Viennese engraving from 1896, and it shows, it's black and white, and it shows a home, and the father is sitting behind the kitchen table with a big smile on his face and a pipe, and the kids are running from Krampus, and in the corner it must be Saint Nicholas in his actual, not as Santa, but as the actual saint in the corner, and just kind of watching over the whole thing. So it's pretty humorous in a way, but then again, it's pretty awful, because I would imagine back then there were parents talking about this person, and kids were legitimately scared, and not that they weren't traumatized enough back then.
Well, religions have used fear, guilt, and coercion to control people for since the beginning of time. And if you think about in the pre-Enlightenment era, and certainly in the Dark Ages and the medieval era, people believed at night that devils and demons and these type of things walked the face of the earth, and having an evil creature to frighten children into behaving. I mean, I certainly don't agree with that as a means of raising or child rearing at all. But if you look at it from where it's coming from, Krampus is a leftover of Norse Viking mythology.
Right.
And then you have this new religion, which is coming in about peace and love and understanding. So there was a clash between. I look at Vikings as sort of Klingons. They're like the Klingons of the ancient world. They were a warrior culture bent on conquest. They didn't care about understanding and being peaceful and touchy-feely. The Vikings wanted to plunder, conquer, loot. That's what they did. And their gods and their religion, their gods were warrior gods. And then you have this religion that comes out of the Middle East, all about light, peace, love, and understanding. And quite frankly, the Vikings didn't go down without a fight, and it's amazing that of all things that remains from that, it's Krampus.
Well, I guess you could argue too that Christianity was a period of enlightenment, but there was some dark periods of Christianity too, where they were like the Vikings, and they just showed up and they conquered, just like the Vikings did. But I think that Christianity outlasted the Vikings so far.
Well, what happened with Christianity is the Romans got hold of it. Once it became the official religion of the empire, then it became an extension of Roman imperial authority. And the Romans were anything but pacifists. So if you go to the teachings of Jesus, it is about peace, love, understanding, tolerance, and acceptance. But when you start using it as moral authority to further the political objectives of ego-driven politicians, and then of course when you get into like the Spanish coming to the New World and subjugating the Aztecs, Mayans, and the Incas, because the Aztec, Mayans, and Incas were loaded with gold and treasure, but they also practiced human sacrifice, and in their rituals, people are dressed up on bird heads and things like this. You get the Spanish, who were basically coming from the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, and they're seeing this, and they're like, well, this clearly is devil worship, so we got to kill all these people, and then in the process, we get to keep all their gold, too. And so Christianity became the religion of the conquerors, when if you go to the roots and to the teachings of Christ, it does not advocate violence, bigotry, hatred, and certainly not conquest.
Mark Anthony, what's coming up next for you? Where do we hear from you? I know you're writing a new book.
I am. I'm working on my next book. I'm hoping it'll be out in 2020. I'm going to be on the Mark Anthony 2020 Visionary Tour. And if people want to find out where I'm going to be, media appearances, where I'm going to be appearing near you, please visit my website, evidenceofeternity.com. We've got a whole bunch of lectures planned throughout the 2020 Visionary Tour. Also, I'll be doing spirit communication. If people want to sign up for a private reading, please go to my website, evidenceofeternity.com, just like my book, Evidence of Eternity. Cameron, I want to thank you for having me on the show. We always have such great conversations, and I appreciate this. And,
good times.
And I do celebrate Christmas. I believe in God. I believe that Jesus brought enlightened teachings. So I want to set that straight for the record. And you know what? Who cares where these traditions come from? I mean, it's interesting to study that, but these traditions bring people who love each other together, bring family together, and in the end, that's the most important thing, because one thing Jesus taught us, and all these symbols are all about everlasting life, and that is what belief and faith in the afterlife is all about, is the belief in everlasting life. So with that, I want to wish all of your listeners of all faiths a happy holiday season, and may God bless all of you.
And that's the best message that we can have this season as well. So I agree 100%. Mark Anthony is the best-selling author of Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity. And again, his website is www.evidenceofeternity.com. Mark Anthony, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cameron.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by ELEON. You can find all ELEON's work online at Heart Dance Records.